Hey, this is Mrs. Reichelt, and next up we're going to talk about the formation of the human skeleton and also go through some ossification kind of stuff and then talk about what happens when you get a bone fracture. So let's go ahead and get started here. In embryos, the skeleton is primarily made up of hyaline cartilage, and then during development, much of that cartilage is replaced by bone. There is still cartilage that remains in some isolated areas. A couple of examples are the bridge of the nose, parts of the ribs, and joints. Okay, I just want to put out my disclaimer. That is by no means all of the cartilage in your body. That's just a couple of examples of where cartilage hangs around after to the infancy and childhood and adulthood. Okay, so bone growth or ossification. Ossification means bone formation. And the epiphyseal plates are going to allow for lengthwise growth. We already talked about that in a couple podcasts ago. And that's going to be responsible for lengthwise growth during childhood. New cartilage will continuously be formed around, and then older cartilage becomes ossified. Cartilage eventually breaks down. And then enclosed cartilage is digested away, which opens a medullary cavity. And then ultimately, I'm not leaving myself enough room here. Okay, and then at the end, bone replaces cartilage. Through the activation of osteoblasts. Okay, so let's go ahead and back up for a minute. Bones are remodeled and lengthened until growth stops. Bones will be remodeled in response to two major factors. Those two factors are blood calcium levels and also the pull of gravity. So gravity pulls on muscle and bone, and so your ossification responds to that specific pull in areas of bones. So bones grow in width as well. So we talked about lengthwise growth, but they also grow in width. That growth is called appositional growth. Appositional growth. Okay, so here are a couple of little pictures. So when we have an embryo, we have the hyaline cartilage model. Then eventually in the fetus, so embryo, we're going to be really not very far along in development. Once we're a fetus, we're a lot later in development, and eventually this cartilage is replaced by bone. And then we have our epiphyseal plate here, which is made up of cartilage, but we have our epiphyseal plate, which is going to allow for lengthwise growth, and then we have widthwise growth, which is called appositional growth. And see, there's another epiphyseal plate as well. So see how you have two of those, and then you have appositional growth going on as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the different types of bone cells. I think in another video we talked about osteocytes, but an osteocyte is a mature bone cell. And then osteoblast, I always think B for building. Osteoblasts are going to be building bone or bone forming cells, and then osteoclasts are going to be breaking down bone or bone destroying cells. Now it's important to know that if your bones are building bone up, they're not just using osteoblasts. They're using osteoblasts and osteoclasts together. So just be aware that we're always using both of those. We're breaking other parts down to redistribute those materials somewhere else and that sort of thing. So the breakdown of the bone matrix for remodeling will release calcium in response to the parathyroid hormone or PTH. And don't worry about the parathyroid hormone too much right now. We have a whole entire chapter, second semester, that's dedicated to the endocrine system. And then bone remodeling is performed by both the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts. Alright, so what happens when we get a bone fracture? So a fracture is a break in a bone, and there are a couple different types of bone fractures. We have a closed fracture, or sometimes we call them a simple fracture. This is a break that doesn't penetrate the skin. And then we have a compound fracture, or sometimes we call it an open fracture, which is the broken bone is actually going to penetrate through the skin. And bone fractures are treated by reduction, and let's just make sure everyone knows what reduction is. Reduction, we're really talking about realignment. So bone fractures are treated by reduction and immobilization, so that you're not going to be able to move it. That's why they put you in a cast. Okay, so the repair of a bone fracture. So step one, I know that some of you like to write everything out step by step. So step one, we have a hematoma. A hematoma is blood-filled swelling. So that's the first thing that happens. Number one, hematoma. Step two is the break is splinted by fibrocartilage. So we have fibrocartilage, step two. Hematoma forms first, fibrocartilage forms second. Next is going to be we have our fibrocartilage callus, which is replaced by a bony callus. So hematoma step one, step two, fibrocartilage, and then step three, the bony callus. And then step four, the bony callus is remodeled to form a permanent bone patch. Okay, and so here are some more examples of different types of fractures, the most common fractures. So you have spiral fractures, impacted, depressed, compressed, green sticks. So you have several different types of fractures. You don't need to know about all of these types of fractures, but what I would like you to know is the difference between the simple and compound fractures and what each of those imply, and how your body, or how the tissues and cells end up repairing each of those fractures.